Oh, I forgot to turn off the recorder. As you will know, we have two great special guests. Let me introduce Daniel Greenfeld and Russell Keith-Magee. We also have to say a big thank you for our sponsors, Magee Team and @Pilot, because thanks to them we have free beers and drinks for everyone. So please get one for you, and we'll start with you. Let's start with the talk session, and Russell will be first, so give him a big hand. So let's start.
Here we go. So yeah, when I get excited, I talk fast, and I'm very easily excited. So if I start talking too fast, please start waving your arms furiously, and I'll try and slow down. So I am here today to talk about Django. I am a member of the Django core team. I have been for about 7.5 years now. I'm also the president of the Django Software Foundation, which is the IP legal fundraising arm that's associated with the Django project as a whole. And I'm here today to peer into my crystal ball, shake my magic 8-ball, call it what you will, to try and give you guys, as members of a Python community, some of you will be Django users, an idea of where Django is going forward. The caveat that I need to put on that is that it really is crystal ball gazing time. Django is a volunteer project, so what gets done is what people stand up and volunteer to do. We don't have a grand product plan that we're going to deliver on a known schedule because we have resources we can dedicate to it. It is literally, if someone is excited enough about an idea, it gets developed. What I'm talking about here are the broad themes, the broad ideas that I can see coming in the near future. One of the best ways to predict the future is to look at what's missing. What doesn't Django have at the moment? We say, the advertising copy says that we are a framework for perfectionists with deadlines. So what is preventing perfectionists from getting their job done? Conversation, I can't remember if it was a private conversation I had with Jacob Kaplan-Moss or if it was actually a public talk he gave. I can't find a reference to it anywhere. But he said good frameworks don't come from academia. They don't come from academic navel gazing. They come from actual real-world problems, trying to solve actual real-world problems. Ruby on Rails and Django are both very practical examples of this. Django didn't come out of an academic exercise of trying to work out how to build websites. It was a real-world newsroom that had real-world problems, trying to solve real-world problems. And that's one of the reasons that I feel that it's been a very, very successful framework. The same is also true of Ruby on Rails if you look through its history. And the thing is, fundamentally, Django provides a very good base toolkit. There's plenty of room for improvement, don't get me wrong. But the working implementations of the important parts for building a modern website exist. And the parts that don't exist, you can actually patch into place. A good example of this, Discuss and Pounce, for those of you who remember, were both running on pre-Django 1.0 using multiple database, or Pounce in particular was using multiple database support years before it ever existed in Django proper. So even if Django itself doesn't have these features, you can get them into Django and solve those real-world problems. But we're not perfect. There are still some pain points, and it's a reasonable bet that those pain points are where the development focus of the core team and hopefully the people around the core team, that's where that focus will lie. So likely to happen. in the near future. The app refactor. This is something that's been talked about for a very long time. I think it's ticket 3571 in track. It's essentially trying to answer the common question of where do I put my application startup logic? Where do I put my signal handlers? At the moment we have a sort of a vague suggestion that you maybe put them into your models.py file, but that's not necessarily the best place, and maybe you could put them in earls.py under certain circumstances, but that's not really the best place. And then there's other questions like, how do I translate an application name? If you've got Django's admin at the moment, it will give you a nice little by application sorted group of all your models, but the application name is fixed. You can't translate it. And obviously, you know, we're in a non-English speaking audience here. That's an issue particularly for non-native English speakers. So the app refactor is about trying to answer that subtle question. What is an app in Django? And to provide a model, a representation for that you can then hook configuration and logic and startup routines and things like that off of it. This is a work in progress. It's been a work in progress for a very long time. We almost got this into 1.5, but we decided not to rush it. And then subsequently, Preston has had a brainwave and realised that there's actually a way we can simplify it even more. It probably won't make it for 1.6. We're looking to freeze 1.6 in a couple of weeks' time. So we're probably looking at 1.7 for this, but it is on our radar and we have been talking about it actively. Another thing we've been talking about actively for a very long time is schema migration. This is probably the one biggest piece of a web framework or of a database-backed web framework that Django doesn't have out of the box, for which there is a de facto standard that almost everybody uses that really should be part of core, called South, that we just need to get into core. And obviously, Andrew Godwin ran his Kickstarter project about a month ago now, was fabulously successful, and schema migration is going to find its way into Django proper. Again, probably not for definitely not for 1.6, probably for 1.7. The practical implementation of this, it's really about, it's sort of two pieces. There's, to use a phrase that was commonly used by Malcolm Tredinnick, rest his soul, there's the plumbing and there's the porcelain. Looking at sort of your bathroom, there is the bits to the pipes to take everything away and bring everything in that you need, and then there's the pretty thing that's sitting on top, which is the bit you actually have to use. The plumbing is important because that's the part that's interacting with database backends. We need a generic database backend way to say, change the name of this table, change the name of this field, make this char field 180 characters instead of 100 characters. And we don't currently have a way of doing that. Once we've got that plumbing in place, we can then stick a nice piece of porcelain on top, which is, okay, let's make something that makes it really easy to define the fact that when someone upgrades this model, they're going to get a bunch of schema changes. This actually opens up a whole bunch of opportunities for Django as well. One of the primary drivers behind the 1.5 feature of making user models customizable was the fact that the email field is currently defaults to a hard code length of 75 characters, which is not long enough to hold every email address. It sounded like a good idea at the time, but now we're stuck in a world where we can't change the default because that would affect everybody's install, but the default is a really dumb value. So we've kind of just got, at the moment, document the fact that it's a dumb value. Once we've got schema migrations in core, things like putting in a default migration that will happen for every email field is something that at least is on the cards. I don't think Andrew's actually specifically targeting that, just to make everything clear, but being able to say, okay, we have a problem in Django's core that is caused by a default field length value. That's now something we can address. Another thing that's been talked about for a very long time, I've forgotten the ticket number on this, I think it's down in the 300s if I remember rightly, 343 rings a bell. Composite primary keys. This is one of these things that anyone who's coming to Django from a database backend looks at Django and says, what do you mean you don't have composite keys? And then they yell and scream at us and we try and ignore them. And composite keys have been worked on for a very long time. It's one of these things that are deceptively simple. It's a very easy concept to explain. It's an obvious concept if you've come from a database background. But getting it to work with all the pieces that are already there is more complex. It was the subject of a Google Summer of Code project 2 years ago. It's looking like it's probably going to be a Google Summer of Code project from the same student this year. We're currently selecting our students at the moment. So in all likelihood, this will actually get a good another 3 months of work from someone dedicated looking at it in the next couple of months. One of the trends that Django 1.5 introduced that I think we're going to see a lot more of going forward is an increase in the level of decoupling of pieces of Django's core. The core team has long resisted introducing a lot of things to Contrib in particular, on the basis that Django doesn't get better because it gets bigger. Django is a community at some level, and we need the community to look after things. Django registration is a perfectly wonderful third-party application for managing registration of new users in Django. It doesn't get any better by putting it in core. So we've deliberately kept it outside of core. And one of the things we started doing in 1.5 was saying, okay, let's find all the things that are in core at the moment that we can make be somewhere else. Local flavor, for example. It is in the interests of the entire Polish language community that I am not involved with the Polish language local flavor built into Django. We need you guys to look after the Polish language local flavor because you're the experts and you have a personal interest in it being good. So we've started the process of splitting local flavor out of Django's core. That doesn't mean we're abandoning it. It means that Django's core will start shrinking and we'll have these decoupled parts in a, hopefully, maintained by the community state. Now, we're not rushing into this. There are a lot of pieces of Django's core that we could move out and we won't for political reasons, for example. Like Django's admin is a really good example of something that should be handled as an external application. But it's also a really big advertising reason for people to use Django in the first place. So we don't want to throw out the baby with the bathwater, as it were. We want to make sure that what we've got is a good core framework with a whole bunch of stuff that's built in and works really well, and start exploiting all the really good packaging tools that Python is starting to get to make sure that it's easy to install and you have this really pleasant out-of-the-box experience when you start using Django. Speaking of Admin 2.0, this gets proposed about every 6 months, and eventually someone's actually going to do it. Django's admin is getting long in the tooth. It looks like a really good 2005 web application because that was when it was built and it hasn't been substantially modified since then. There are a lot of things that admin could do that but it doesn't do, or it's very hard to make it do. There are areas where people have requested it to be configurable, where it isn't configurable. And to some extent, we don't want Django's admin to become, a great new CMS application. That's what you have Django CMS and Find CMS and all the other alternatives out there, Mezzanine, to do. But there's a lot of room for improvement. There's a lot of room for us to eat our own dog food, as it were. Django now has class-based views, but admin doesn't use them. And interestingly, admin actually exposes some bugs that class-based views specifically addressed. So it's a big project, and as I said at the beginning, the best pieces of architectural advancement don't come from an academic process, they come from someone who actually needs them. No one has stepped up and actually has that much of a need for a new Django admin that it's driven their development process and made them commit 6 months to building it right. Now, that's not to say it's the only way that can be built, but we have this long-term picture of we'd like to improve admin, but no one with the spare time to actually do it. It can be developed externally to Django. It doesn't need to be done in Django's core, and I think it'd be an ideal example of something where what we just do is quietly deprecate Django's built-in admin, and this one that's external we start pointing at and saying, hey, use this one over here. But that depends upon the thing externally actually existing. Another very big change that we're going to start seeing very soon is a change in our release schedule. From Django 1.0 to Django 1.5, we've averaged a release every 11 months. Essentially, once per year, we put out a major release. And that's worked okay, but it is fairly, internet time, that's glacial. When we released 1.5, we made a internal modification to the way that we release Django, which starts to make faster release schedules something we can actually target. Prior to 1.5, when we said, okay, we're going to release 1.4, we said, okay, the trunk branch or trunk is now frozen. You cannot add new features to trunk. And you would sit there and people would say, okay, well, I've got this great new feature I want to add. No, hold off. You've got to wait 3 months until we release 1.4 final. Then we can commit your patch. A lot of people commented that this was a really big buzzkill because I've got this great patch and it's finished and it's ready to integrate and it's ready to go, but I've got to wait. So what we did with 1.5 is say, okay, we're going to branch off at 1.5. This is our release branch. This is what we're going to cut. No new features go into this branch, but if you've got something fresh you want to add, you can add it to trunk. And within weeks of 1.5 being branched off, this was happening back in October of last year, we had major features in Django's repository that were not going to be part of 1.5. What that means is that when we actually released 1.5 in March of this year, we were essentially in a position to release a 1.6 that had new features. And so we're looking at essentially setting our alpha branching point, the branching point for 1.6, being after the sprints for DjangoCon Europe. So essentially late next week. We're going to be branching off and saying, okay, this is the release branch for 1.6. The upside of this is that new features get into production faster. It means that if you've got this faster release schedule, if you've got a great idea, we make some great change to the way forms work or some great way that we change the way admin works, that gets into actual production use a lot faster. The downside is that there's some changes that are going to need to happen to our backporting policy and our backwards compatibility policy. Historically, we've supported our current stable release and our previous release as a security release. And that essentially means that when we rolled out a new feature that was backwards incompatible in some way, like for example the change to the syntax for URL tags, you had about 2 years before that became a serious problem. Before you actually had, you were committed, you had to make the change if you were going to upgrade. If we reduce that to being a 6-month cycle, well, all of a sudden now you've only got a year because you've only got 2 releases, you've only got a year now. If we reduce it to 3 months, well, you've got 6 months before you've got to upgrade. So we're going to have to do something there. What that something is, we're still discussing. A likely outcome is to be a long-term stability release. So 1.5 will become a long-term support release. We will commit to providing security patches for 1.5 for 2 years, but other releases will come along the way. I'd like to tell you a story about a man. Once upon a time, a man had a problem. He fixed it with a singleton. He now had 2 problems. Unfortunately, Django has a very big singleton stuck in the middle of it, the conf object, the settings object. And it's really, really hard to fix this problem. It's kind of so hard baked into the core of how Django is set up that changing it is a real problem. But it's at the core of so many of our problems, is this singleton of conf settings and how it works up, how that gets set up. It complicates the startup sequence, it complicates the testing process. There are so many things that the settings object causes problems for us. We need to address this. Alex Gamer gave a really good talk about this at DjangoCon 2012, which is well worth watching. I don't necessarily agree with his proposed solution, but I definitely agree with his analysis that it's a problem we need to fix. How it's going to be fixed, step 3, we make a profit. I don't know what step 2 is. So yeah, there are people who sort of talk that one line of thought is we should do what Python 3 did. Say, okay, it's bad, we've just got to break backwards compatibility, make a big shift and move on to the next thing. Python 3 has done as good a job as I think you can expect a language community to do, making that sort of big split, big backwards compatibility split. But it hasn't been seamless. There have been all sorts of internal community debates about Python 3 is a waste of time, Python 3 is a dead end because no one's using it and Django doesn't support it yet. Oh yes, we do now. Oh, but no one cares because none of the other libraries are in Python 3 yet. Python almost gets away with it because it is a huge community. Django is a large community, but it's not the size of Python's. So we need to be very, very careful if we're going to decide making a backwards compatibility break of the scale that Python 3 did. And changing the singleton object of settings would be that kind of catastrophic event. It would change, essentially every line of code would need to be modified in some subtle way to handle this change of a settings object. So yeah, we don't want to throw out the baby with the bathwater here. We've got a good community. We've got a good user base. We don't want to destroy that user base just so we can have something that's slightly architecturally more pure. So that's about as good as I can go with predictions of things that are likely to happen in sort of the relatively short term, getting onto medium term with things like the settings object. Let's go into the long-term predictions here. This is where I start to get very, very speculative, very, very low accuracy, and I'm in no way held to any predictions that I make here. I think Django as a community, or as a project, has a responsibility to share a lot better with the broader Python community than we have historically. In biology, we sort of see this, like there was a Cambrian explosion that was followed by the Ordovician extinction event. You have this massive explosion of great ideas, and most of them die off and you end up with one or two survivors. Django is essentially one of those survivors. If you go back to the era where Django came out in 2005, there was about 15 or 20 web frameworks that were all in Python and were all at equal levels of, kind of working. Django survived and became the long-term running thing. But as a result of the fact that it survived, it's done its own thing and has sort of ignored some of the other interesting things that are happening in the Python community. We've seen examples in other language communities where these sort of project mergers can be really, really strong community unifying events. Rails 3 was essentially the result of merging MERB into Rails, a completely separate web framework merged into Rails, and changed what Rails was, but broadened the base of what a Rails user was. It took a while, but Rails as a project is stronger as a result. Even in the Python community, we see that with pylons and turbo gears and the sort of the collection of projects that merged together and renamed themselves as Pyramid. The question I've got for you as Python users, and some of you as Django users, does the broader Python community benefit from having half a dozen mostly compatible WSGI implementations? I'd argue probably not. WSGI's a fairly bog standard protocol. It was designed to be simple. We really should only have one implementation of that. Yet Pyramid has one, Django has one, Verkzeug's got one built in there, which is kind of, we shouldn't have more than one of these. And I think there's room to say, okay, well, Django should maybe look at, can we replace our WSGI implementation with one that the rest of the Python community is using? Again, I'm not saying this is something that's going to be easy to do. I think it's a long-term aspirational goal that we should be trying to make Django a better user of the tools that exist in the broader Python community. Now, to be clear here, Django has been tagged as a not invented here framework. The one criticism that gets flagged quite often is, why doesn't Django use SQL Alchemy? The reason Django doesn't use SQL Alchemy is because SQL Alchemy didn't exist when we built Django's ORM. We built a competitor to SQL Alchemy before SQL Alchemy existed to be a competitor. Now, that said, we have a lot of internals of query logic that really do the same thing that SQL Alchemy does. So there's a lot of argument to be made for the fact that the internals of Django's ORM could quite possibly be replaced with SQL Alchemy, providing the friendly, well-documented friendly interface that Django users are familiar with, but giving them all the flexibility of SQL Alchemy on the back end. And this isn't completely, look at what Russell's smoking territory. This is actually been discussed a couple of times. If you go back, almost 5 years now, there was actually a branch in Django's SVN repository specifically to do this. It didn't actually end up going anywhere, but that doesn't mean that it can't be done. And I think it's well worth, if someone's looking for a great project to take up in their spare time, it'd be a really interesting project to do. And I think would be valuable, not just to Django, but to the Python community as a whole, because all of a sudden you get all the benefit of SQL Alchemy. SQL Alchemy gets a bigger user group because all the Django users in the world become SQL Alchemy users as well. Django users gain a whole bunch of extra capabilities that are difficult or unwieldy under the current ORM setup. So, would this be a good thing? Well, it's a definite maybe, but it's at least worth looking into because we have this library that the Python community is using that Django doesn't use. In some cases, there are very good reasons why Django doesn't use it. Okay, one of the original design decisions behind Django's ORM was it is not SQL. We have a really, really good language for describing relational queries. It's called SQL. So you should be using it. Django's ORM is an object relational mapper. It's a way of making objects appear on a relational database. But it's not just a relational database. Essentially, it's a way of making objects behave themselves. Django's ORM was specifically designed, and many of the decisions that have been made over time have been specifically to avoid adding SQL semantics to the ORM. So that when things like MongoDB start being popular or CouchDB start being popular, we can put other data stores behind Django's ORM. This is something that SQL Alchemy can't do by design. Now that doesn't mean that SQL Alchemy is a bad project. It's a great project for SQL. It's just not a great project for Mongo. Django is in a position here to be able to say, okay, well, we're the front end to this. We use SQL Alchemy for SQL because it's a good thing to do. We use whatever Mongo's back end is for Mongo. But we can provide you with that pretty layer on the front. The catch is that what you end up there is a situation where you start looking for the lowest common denominator. You know, what is the what is the minimum subset of queries that you can issue on both MongoDB and SQL and still have something that you call a query engine? And you end up with such a small set of features that it ends up being useless. So that itself, you know, that was a sort of, Alex Gaynor worked on a Summer of Code project and we stalled on a couple of regions, and that's sort of why the project stalled, is that you don't really want the minimum subset. You want to be able to use all the good things you can use in SQL and all the good things you can use in Mongo and just have this kind of middle ground, whatever that is. It might really just mean reposing the actual question. A lot of people, when they say we want NoSQL support in Django, what they really mean is we want to be able to load our MongoDB object into Django's admin. And that's a lot easier thing to answer, because essentially all you've got to be able to do is issue some really simple CRUD operations. And, well, yeah, we can do that. Here's your Mongo object sitting up, and you can issue a search and you can do a filter. Maybe not that efficient, unless you've got the filter, you've got the MongoDB backend in place. But, you know, it could appear in your admin interface. So, you know, there's some discussion that needs to happen there. I'd also want to talk just briefly about sort of extinction level events. These are the things that are going to kill Django if we don't start paying attention to them. Okay, Django is a great framework for 2005, but it's 2013 now. The internet has changed, the web has changed. There are a lot of things that are happening now that Django doesn't have a great answer for. It has an answer for, and there are some people who are doing them, but because we're a volunteer project, no one is paying full-time attention to making sure these extinction level events are answered. And if we don't come up with, as a community, we don't come up with an answer soonish, we may find out that Django ends up going the same way that Zope went, or PHP. For the love of God, why won't it go? So we need to start paying attention to some of these. Time, and I say this cringing because I'm a physics undergraduate, and real time means things that you fucking can't pull on the web. I'm calm now. Real time, as you web people like to talk about, Django doesn't have a good answer for that. I've seen a couple of people propose solutions that involve using a Redis data queue being served by Node.js, and then there's an actual main site served by Django, but that means I've got to use Node.js, and that's bad. So why doesn't Django have a good solution for real-time type problems? That's something we need to start paying attention to, because it's kind of, all the cool kids are doing it. Everyone's moving to Node.js, using Node.js because it can do these cool things. Why can't you do that in Django? Oh, yep, sorry. There's also this client-server separation split. Django has for a very long time maintained we are a server-side framework. Use whatever you want to use on the front end. We're a server-side framework, pick your front-end framework, off you go. And again, that works fine in 2005, is problematic in 2013 because so much of what you do at the front end is dynamically interacting with what's happening on the back end, and the reason Meteor is so popular is because you write the code once and it occurs in both places, and you've got consistent validation, you've got consistent models on both sides of the aisle. We can't ignore this long term. But by the same token, there's a reason why this split exists. JavaScript. JavaScript is the only language, effectively, you can use on a web browser. So if you want to have the same validation logic on your client side and your server side, well, that means you've got to write your validation logic in JavaScript, doesn't it? I certainly hope not, because I don't like JavaScript. I like Python. I'd like to continue to use it, but the world is sort of moving to this, we're moving to this place where the only language that is actually really viable at the moment is JavaScript for doing this client-server, if you want to have the same logic on both ends. And okay, CoffeeScript proves that you can use a different language and kind of call it JavaScript, but then it's always going to be a sort of a second-place citizen. Maybe those tools can get a lot better. You know, the source, I'm going to forget the name. Source, yes, sorry.
Source map?
Source map, that's the one. Source maps are making the debugging of CoffeeScript a lot better, but you know, it's still not perfect. There's a lot of room to go. And it's not just a Django problem here. This is a problem for everyone who's using Python. If it doesn't matter what web framework you use, you can't use Python on the web. We can't use it on the client side unless you're using some other thing that isn't, you know, it isn't a first order, you know, native piece of the web. Related to that, how many of you have got a web application or a mobile application that's written in Python? Can I hear a cock crowing in the distance? You write Objective-C, you write Java. If you're really lucky, you're writing a HTML5 app, again, writing it in JavaScript. Python doesn't have any good client-side solutions for mobile at this point. There's a couple of people who are tinkering with projects, but there's no, hey, look, Django, it's a wonderful web framework. Hey, look, X, it's a wonderful mobile framework. That doesn't exist yet. And it's an extinction level event. If we don't have a good answer for how you build your mobile application in Python, how it integrates well with your Django application, Django ceases to become or becomes less relevant as a result. So how do we make all this stuff happen? How do we protect the language and the communities that we have and we like long term? This is a cultural challenge. I don't know that I have any particular solutions. All I know is that there's a line from The West Wing, for those of you who are fans of the show, decisions are made by those who show up. We need people to actually contribute, to volunteer, to have the good idea, to convince their boss to let them spend a bit of time tinkering, to take the thing that they are using internally and turn it into a major external project, the same way that Django did. We need a constant supply of these volunteers, or else open source as a broader concept starts to fall in a hole. Open source only works because people volunteer, or people have found a way to turn their commercial activities into something that they can then leverage for their own gain, but are giving it away in an attempt to do that, to get that gain. So it's not all doom and gloom. To borrow from NASA, per aspera ad astra, from adversity we head to the stars. We've done great things. The Django community has achieved great things. If you look at the feature list of Django 1.0, look at the feature list of Django before its first release in July 2005, and compare it to what we have today, we've done amazing things. You compare it to what the state of the art is from commercial companies like Microsoft that are producing web frameworks, they're stealing from us, not the other way around. We have a great framework. We have great tools. We have an immense community of very talented people who are contributing to it. We can achieve great things. We just need to work out where we're going, aspire for greatness, and see if we can make it happen. So yes, hard work, but nothing worthwhile is ever easy. So there we go. If you have any questions, I'm happy to take them. Yes.
I heard a few people criticizing the Django development team, especially the core development team, for being supposedly a very closed group. Especially one person said that there weren't any changes in the past years in this team.
Someone's been reading their Django developer list this week. Yeah, okay. For those who haven't been tracking Django developers, their ticket 901 was adding a small feature, relatively small piece to the ORM, which was about 5 years ago rejected by Jacob, and Jacob said, no, I don't see the benefit of doing that. That person then opened the ticket again, reopened the ticket, and said, oh, but I think it's really, really important. At which point, Jacob closed it again, saying, no, I really don't see the point. Let's keep the ORM nice and clean. At which point he opened the ticket again, and he was told by James Bennett, no, if you want to discuss this, take it to Django developers. And then it sort of sat there stagnant for a little while, and then someone else perked up and said, oh no, this is a really great idea because I needed to do this. And then a whole conversation started about how no new features ever get added to Django, and Django's core don't accept new features, and it's completely futile to discuss any new features because no new features ever get added. At which point I then have a small meltdown. I responded in as polite a set of terms as I could at the time. And that hasn't gone well. So yeah, the point that I was trying to make is that it is abjectly and demonstrably false to say that it is futile to propose new features to Django. Django 1.5 had many, many features that weren't in Django 1.4. And every single one of those features came from somewhere, from someone proposing them. The difference is, what I said before, decisions are made by those who show up. The Ticket 901 has been discussed exactly once on the Django developers mailing list. We have a mailing list, we document the fact that we have a mailing list, we document our process and say, if you want to discuss a new feature, please take it to the mailing list. That means you've got to take it to the mailing list. So, yeah, that said, some of the subsequent conversation that's been popped up raises a valid point, that unless you know Django's development process, it isn't obvious that you need to take it to the mailing list. And it isn't necessarily inherently obvious why we're telling you to take it to the mailing list. So we have, at some level, a communications problem here of we, as a core team, want to get something done. I don't want to spend my entire day writing the same answer on every ticket on track to say, please take this to Django developers, and here's the 4-page explanation for why we need to take it to Django developers. So there's a sort of a compromise here between what works as a project, how we can actually get stuff done without getting bogged down in the minutiae, and letting newcomers who have an idea not feel like they're being told to bugger off, no, just get back in your box and you'll get exactly what we give you. I don't know what the answer to this is. And I've asked an open question to the mailing list here, is that, okay, I'm mea culpa, I did this completely wrong. How do we do it better? Tell us, how do we change Django's development process so that newcomers don't feel like contributing is futile? I don't know what the answer is. And if anyone in this room has a great idea, please let me know, because we want Django's community to be vibrant. We want newcomers to have that fantastic out-of-the-box experience. First time you contribute should feel like a win, because if you win, you come back. And if you come back, then Django's community gets bigger and everyone wins, and yeah, the snowball keeps rolling down the hill. Everything's won, and there's puppies for everyone. So yeah, I don't know what the answer is. The caveat on all of this is that, it's very easy to make suggestions. It's also, we're not new at this game. We've been doing this for 7.5 years, and there are a lot of things that don't work. There are a lot of things that don't scale. And Django's community, something like, I think Jacob worked out something like 10-15% of packages on PyPI, on the Python package index, are tagged as Django projects. We're a big community. Anything we do has to scale to being large. That imposes some constraints that knock off a lot of seemingly obvious ideas.
What about moving one or two persons from the to the core one or two major contributors to the core development team? Have you ever considered it?
Not only have we've added one in the last month.
Oh, so
we do regularly add new developers.
So these accusations were generally false.
Well, the accusations were being made, yes, were based upon a video that was done in 2009, which we responded to by adding 5 core developers.
I understand.
Yeah, so in particular, Eric Fiorenzano did call us out it was like DjangoCon 2009, 2010? 2009, yeah. And he called us out, and he was absolutely right. Back then, the core team was too small, and we were getting bogged down on who actually had the commit bit. And the literal question he asked is, why isn't Alex Gaynor a committer yet? Well, guess what? Alex Gaynor's a committer, has been for about 3 years now. So, yeah, some of those criticisms were completely off base. We have been responding. Have we done all the responding we need to do? No. There's obviously always room for improvement. So.
Can I?
Yep.
As a member of the Django corporate development team.
Yes.
What do you think about the current state of migration to Python 3? Because it's a big project. Maybe you know something. Is some large Django deployment moving to Python 3 already?
There's one very large one, the Python website. So that is probably the highest profile one that I am aware of. This actually points to one of the biggest problems that Python, open source, Django broadly have. When a Rails project announces the fact they're a Rails project, they stand from the highest rooftop they can and say, we're cool. Python guys tend not to. So it's very hard to tell who's using Python, who's using Django, and who isn't. Instagram is a Django site. I challenge you to find out any evidence that points to that. So I have a real difficulty, even as someone who's in the core team, I have a real difficulty in pointing at people who I know are using Python 3 or I know are using Django under Python 3.
And from bug reports, something like this, is something happening?
Oh, so Django 1.5 supports Python 3.
Yeah, I know, but is someone using this working in production environment? Do you know from bug reports? What do you feel?
Well, okay, I feel that it is not being used. It is being used by some people. It is not being used by enough people for me as someone. I don't personally have any code on Python 3. So I can't stand up and sort of say, well, okay, I know it works, so come on, everyone, jump on board. Jacob Kaplan-Moss is probably the best example of one because he is doing the Python 3 thing. I'm hoping I'll be able to meet him in about a month's time at DjangoCon Australia. I hope I'll be able to get his teardown of exactly what's going on there and get the, by proxy, his confidence, and then start sharing that confidence with everyone else.
A few things to say about it, and I believe he's working on not just the Python.org, but another site in Python 3 as well that he can't talk about. So
Right. Okay. So as soon as he can talk about it, we'll be fine.
really optimistic on it.
Yeah. Yeah, I have no reason to believe that it's fundamentally flawed or anything like that. I just don't have a great body of point at least 15 examples they're all using Python 3. And that's what we need to convince everybody else to come and start using Python 3. So I appreciate exactly what you're saying. We need, as soon as anyone does in this room, come tell me so I can tell other people. Yeah.
New PyWAW website will be using Python 3.
Yeah. We'll start. Yeah, Danny?
So my question is, with building admin 2.0 as a separate project, one of the issues is that in Django, if you have any kind of API that's is prefixed with an underscore, let's say models.meta, like I have a model and it's got underscore meta, the documentation explicitly says you cannot count on this
Not changing.
API remaining,
Yep.
which kills any reason to work on admin 2.0 outside of Django. Now I know I've heard on mailing goes, oh, but it's actually stable, but the documentation says something different.
Yeah, it's a stable.
Is there, one thing would be neat, because you have forms.capital meta. Could we have a models.capital meta? And that way I can tell you that you will see admin tools being generated.
Yeah, okay. So the reason, there's sort of two reasons why we haven't formalized it. One is that it's sort of, yeah, it's formal. Just don't rely on us being formal. So there's that kind of informal, formal. We wouldn't be able to change it without causing all manner of crap. There's a running joke. If you actually go, if you're bored one evening, go run through all of Django's commit messages. There's a recurring theme that pops up every now and then. This will only affect the journal world. It's essentially changes to internal APIs that they know will only affect people who are working at the Lawrence Journal World on Ellington, which was essentially the commercial framework that's based on Django that came out of Lawrence, Kansas. We know we can't change the way that get objects by list on Meta works. What we really need to do is to sit down and formalize, no, okay, seriously, this is our API. We've got to formalize Meta and actually give it a name. It's just that, again, it's one of these commercial driving projects. It's really boring work to do. Someone needs to do it. Volunteers, please form to my left. Yeah, I agree completely. We need to do it, but there's no driving push to do it because it won't actually change anything other than the perception of whether it's stable.
Property? I mean,
even absolutely, we could absolutely say, okay, it's just called. Or we could put a line on our backward compatibility policy that says the one exception to the underscore policy is underscore meta.
or can you just do like model.capital meta and have that as a property that gets grabbed?
Could be. The issue is part of the reason why we haven't done that is there are parts of the internals of underscore meta that are ugly.
Okay.
They're ugly. So there is some clear needs to happen there, and the process of standardizing it would make it less ugly, hopefully. There's a lot of duplication, a lot of stuff that's cached very badly that we should fix, but it works, so there's no incentive to fix it. Unless someone wants to sit down and volunteer to fix it? Anyone? Anyone? So, yeah. There's another question.
Yeah, one thing you didn't mention is performance. And it pop-ups on the Django mailing list from time to time that with every release, Django is slower and takes up more memory.
Yep.
And it's actually true. And there's even Django bench which proves that.
Yep.
But there's nothing with that.
1.6 should address that significantly. I haven't seen the numbers out of Django Bench myself, but there's a couple of changes that have been made to the ORM specifically to address that. One of the reasons it's so expensive, or one of the reasons it's so slow, the slowdown has happened, is because there's lots of internal copying of data structures that really don't need to be copied. There are some things that slowed the system down that were just unavoidable. When we introduced multiple databases, you can't just assume that you've got a database. You have to start doing a database. You have to do a lookup before you can get to the database. That's going to make things slower. But that's not where the bulk of the slowdown happens. It's the internals of how do we build a query tree, how do we build subtrees.
Apart from the ORM, there's like the URL resolver, templates, and.
But we've also added features.
Yeah.
So it's would you like the speed? It's
features that slow down things 3 times. Like,
I don't know if 3 times is quite accurate, but
the translation thing actually slows it down more than 3 times.
Sure. But do you like translations? No. Well, okay.
No, that's right.
Right. Okay. Well. Okay. Fair point. That we do need to pay more attention to performance. I suppose the reason why it hasn't is because it's never been bad enough to drive people away. The classic example that I have, I come from Perth, Western Australia, and I go to DjangoCon in the US, and I hear people complain about the 100 millisecond connection time for getting access to their database. From Perth, Western Australia to a data center in Dallas, Texas, if you had a straight line cable going from between those two locations, the data is not getting back any faster than 300 milliseconds. The database connection time is a rounding error compared to the physical connection time. That doesn't excuse poor performance, but it means that there's performance and there's performance. There's things that are actually slowing your site down and preventing you from getting customers, and there are things that are just you looking at a benchmark page to try and work out where things are slow. I have not seen any examples. Django has been built to allow you to build database-backed websites quickly, high-featured database-backed websites quickly. If you go back, actually, really good example. You go back to the very, very first DjangoCon. Watch Cal Henderson's talk, and Cal Henderson, for those who don't know, is the guy who built Flickr, and he gave one of the very first keynotes at the very first DjangoCon. If you haven't seen it, it's a stunning talk, just as an example of a talk. He's a very, very talented speaker, very amusing speaker. But one of the things he points out is that it's very, very difficult to build a web framework that is usable for the top 1% of websites in the world. The good news is that 99% of the world's websites are not in the top 1% of the websites in the world. And so there's a lot of space you can use very generic frameworks. When you get to that top 1%, you're not going to be using Django anymore. You're going to be building your own custom-built framework that does exactly what you need, because that's the only way you're going to be serving 20% of the world's web traffic. There's a lot of market space that Django can fill without being obsessed about performance. Not to say that its performance isn't important, but there's a balance to be had there.
Okay, so is there some plan to track this more fully?
Is there a plan to? No. Could there be? Sure. Want to volunteer? There we go. Right. Excellent. We've got a volunteer. So feel free. If you want to set that up, we've got a Travis CI instance. There's a possibility we're going to get one set up to run a Selenium test.
Travis, the same thing. think most people here, even if they contribute, they don't know it exists even.
Right, okay, in which case we've got a communications problem. We're back to the, we have it, but no one knows it's there. So, again, we need a contributor to someone to say, okay, well, we need to do this, this, and this. Can we make this change to the website? Can we put this thing into the documentation? These are it's not like I'm sitting around at home waiting for things to do. I've got plenty of stuff to do. We need advice from the community about which things we need to do next, and volunteers from the community to build the things that we then are going to point at. So if you think there's an opportunity here for benchmarking tools that are pointed at on the Django website that we can then say, hey, wait a second, that commit's caused a 20% slowdown in URL lookup or whatever, absolutely. That sounds like a great idea. Please do it.
Okay, so we have to Russell.
I do hope I didn't.
complicated Eastern European technology. And how do I, oh, not an ear thing. I'm not listening to you, you're listening to me. Oops, and then I broke this.
Cannot brain American anyway.
So for now, let's do like this one.
Okay. Can you hear me? Okay.
We're coding for that.
Okay. Hi, my name is Daniel Greenfeld. This is my second time in Poland. I came here last year, but my ancestors were here for a long time. They left around 90 years ago, and they came to the USA, and I'm back. And I've learned some Polish. I can say tak and lewo and dzięki and dziękuję. Did I say that right? Okay. I still have problems saying nastrojem. And then we were in Spain right before we came here, and I was learning Spanish. And so now when people speak to me in Polish, I respond in Spanish. So, but yeah, Poland's awesome. Thank you for having us. Me and Audrey, we really appreciate it. We love you guys. So this is my talk, Python Worst Practices. About me, I do cartwheels. I'll do it at the end. Remind me at the end. So yeah, my name is Daniel Greenfeld. I'm known as PyDanny. I do Python at a shop called Cartwheel Web, which is named after my hobby. I do Python and Django there. I learned Python at NASA, and which was awesome. Oops. Who here uses OpenStack by any chance? OpenStack? Raise your hand higher. Okay. All right. So you know the godparent of that nebula comes out of NASA, right? Okay. Audrey Roy is my fiance, and we met because of Python. So Python was really awesome. And I co-wrote a book. This is it right here. And so we actually brought some here if you guys want to look at it and stuff. One thing that Russ made clear today, which is our nightmare, is that we have to work on the 1.6 edition quickly. You can pass that around. Apparently we have to work on the 1.6 edition quickly. And if you've ever, who has written a book or a really big thesis paper? I know there's PhDs in the room, so yeah. Yeah, it's a lot of work. So thank you, Russ. Stop working on Django.
I'll do what I can.
Okay, but this isn't a talk about Django. It's about things not to do in Python. And we're all smart, but we're all human. And you know, the Polish developers that I've worked with have been really, really smart, which means I've seen stuff like this from everybody, be it in New Zealand and Australia to, yeah, for some of you people here. So each section is going to have 3 parts. There's going to be a Python worst practice, what not to do, and then a fixed Python practice, which is kind of my suggestion after hearing feedback from luminaries in the field, and then a side-by-side comparison slide. And the slides are already online. I forgot to put the link, sorry. I'll post that on Twitter afterwards. Whatever you do, and I have to make this really explicit because when I gave earlier versions of this talk, people took it literally. I mean, they looked at the worst practices thing. So you'll see lots of labels saying worst practice. There's a reason for that. In fact, I convinced Jacob Kaplan-Moss to change some of his slides on a similar talk he gave about Django because I was like, dude, people are going to take this and use it as something cool. And if you're smart, you'll be able to figure out which part that's from. Okay, so you know, try to use some of these practices. You might get complimented. People think you're smart. Okay, so the basics of Python. Stuff like this, where you're replacing Python built-ins with. Can everybody see that? Okay, good, because I can't really help you if you can't. It's where you're replacing Python built-ins with your own stuff. Yeah, zip is really common for US developers. You'll see this in a lot of Django applications with addresses. ID, I do this one all the time. And the thing is I admit I have a problem with this, that I still use ID in places, and that gives me the license to pick on others in this talk. Okay, this is how you should be doing it if you're going to do it. So obj equals my object. We can infer that, even though I don't like abbreviations that much, that's a safe one. You can use underscores afterwards. Not really my favorite, but some people like it. You can use map obj to I mean, this is obvious stuff. I know that there's Polish equivalents, but just, I guess, keep aware of this stuff. So there's the comparison slide, what not to do and what to do. Very explicit, because what is it? It's the 18th cone of Python. Explicit is better than implicit. Okay, here's a good one. Okay, now if you notice, these aren't, I haven't replaced capital true, capital T true, but when you're coding, it doesn't matter. This will really hammer you hard. This will really mess up your day. Yeah, you can do that. Usually, what's that?
The last one doesn't work anymore.
Oh, in Python 3 it doesn't work. Oh, wow, okay. I need to update that.
Use Python 3.
Yeah, usually we get this happens with APIs. So for example, let's say that we have some API that we're using, and for whatever reason, they're returning 0. Now, we can make fun of this if it was written in Python, but there are other languages where truthfulness is 0, right? And other things aren't. So this isn't that uncommon. And when you have a developer who's new to Python in 2006 working at NASA, I'm not saying it was me. So this is one solution. I know some of the people are like, oh, don't use classes, but this is just an example where here what we're doing is we've got a consumer object, because we're playing with an object-oriented language, and when we get a response, we just reverse the response. So if the response comes back as 0, we just do something like this. I mean, this is easy. This is trivial, you know. And this is something that once we do it in one place, we can move it to all sorts of other places. We get into code reuse with the crazy API consumer. So there you go. Worst practice and fixed practice. Okay. Here's a good one. And I'm going to hit you guys with the quiz, so study this carefully. Okay, so in other tools and languages, it can be useful to identify types of prefixes. So for example, color is a string, so we prefix it with str, and so on. And you know, we also mix in cases because we're not being PEP 8 compliant. But then again, there's a hobgoblin of little minds. So for example, if we're playing with twisted, we may not prefix it, but of course we do the mixed case. Okay, so here, sometimes you have too many pixels on the screen. Maybe you've got that 80-column character count, so you want to reduce it. So color, you just get rid of the vowels, right? So it simplifies things. English has about, in my unofficial estimation, has about the same number of vowels per word as Polish. So this kind of makes sense. It's a good way to reduce the number of pixels on the screen, because you got to save those pixels. Okay, now quick. What's this represent? What does it represent? Anyone? Raise your hand. I can't hear you. Oh, good. Okay, good. So, wow, that's impressive. I stumped PyCon New Zealand on this one, so Poland rocks. Okay, so yeah, I mean this is basics, but it's easy to forget. You know, we're consenting adults. We can figure out what a variable is based off of what's being passed in. So if the purpose of something, if I'm sorting through, if I'm writing something that's a color picker and I'm looking through colors, then yeah, it's pretty obvious what we're doing. And then don't be too constrained by type. We've got a language which is dynamically typed. Use that, abuse it. And then, of course, use long variable names. I mean, really, we can cut and paste. Python allows us to break lines, so if you do have to hit that 80-column character count, or someone will complain, break the line, or better yet, be really dangerous and edgy and go over 80 columns. See? Okay, so, all right, next one. Don't use enumerate. I did this for a while. I mean, not me, but some guy at NASA did. So use enumerate. It's really nice. But the lesson is, it's funny, but learn the built-ins. When you start to write, when you start to write little functions, there's a good chance. Even if you've been doing Python for a while, it's good to revisit. How many keywords does Python have, or how many built-ins does Python have? Anyone off the top of your head? No? What's that? 40-something. 40-something. So yeah, no one here knows the count. So that means that there's a pretty good chance that if you went back to it and read through them, you might happen to discover one. Oh wow, I didn't know Python did that as a built-in. Oh, I guess I get to refactor code. Yeah, it makes code, and it's also, the thing is you can I've written my own version of built-ins not knowing that the built-in was there, and that's great. I mean, it's a good exercise in computer science skills, but what's a Python built-in is proven. I mean, really smart people have written really good tests for it. So there, side by side. Here's a good one. If you're presenting, present with stuff you can't read, or your people can't read.
Better than common sense.
What's that? Yeah. So high contrast, easy to read fonts. There are people who will argue that what I could do is I could switch this. I could make it a black background and white letters, and that's just as effective. They are wrong. If you talk to anyone from any visual effects studio, anywhere, anyone who's really doing work with vision, they will tell you that's incorrect. If you aren't using this, because this is what we've been dealing with for thousands of years, and maybe because it works, or we've been evolved to see this well, I think it's black with red letters, actually, is better than black with white. But the best thing, the way you're going to be most secure if you're presenting at a conference and you don't know what the projector setup is like, this is safe. People like Kenneth Wrights, he goes everywhere and presents everywhere, he can get away with it, but he does like 900 talks a year. He knows what he's doing. The rest of us are just amateurs. What's that?
Don't tell him that, please.
Okay. So yeah, there's the comparison. Oops, wrong way. Classes. Let's get into classes. Okay, so he has done Java. Okay. So yeah, when you come over to Python, this is an oldie but a goodie, where you set up getters and setters with Python, I guess accessors and mutators. With get name and set name, you name that way.
Should be double underlined, yeah.
Actually use the properties in Python. It's not that hard. It's kind of neat once you get the hang of it. Basically, my getter is just returning the value of the name, which is PyDanny doing it the right way. And then, because it's probably a string because it's a name, I infer from it, relating back to previously where I can infer from the name of the variable what its action is, as long as my English is good. And I could then set the value. So there you go. Here's a good one. Has anyone ever seen this one? Okay, this is, you run into this sometimes, especially with people who play around with lots of different languages. Okay, so everyone here knows Python, right? Raise your hand if you do. Okay. Who here knows Ruby? Raise your hand. I know a little bit. JavaScript, raise your hand. So when you switch between languages, you take patterns and stuff. How many people have done like 10 languages in the past 3 years? Okay. Okay, so he has. Awesome. All right. Well, I don't know what it is. Maybe it's a California thing, but you get into you find these people who, I've done Scala, I've done JavaScript and Python or Ruby and stuff like that, and their code ends up looking like this. So this is something that I guess isn't topical for you guys, but basically it's where I use the property method to make the connect method. You have to access it, setting up the connection to the XML RPC server, but I can't. You're not doing parentheses. You're just doing the bs.connect. So it looks like Ruby code. So yeah, use methods. It's easy. It's fun. It's what we're used to. Exceptions. So okay. Yeah, it's not. Yeah, you really don't. Can everyone see it? So basically, ignorance is not bliss. If you don't know what your exception is doing, you have no idea what your system what's actually happening in your system. You have silent exceptions. You have errors that you may never find, but your users and consumers might be dealing with and probably are. And it's better to just let your system crash. I could make a really good argument for that. And here's the awesome thing about this. My general response to seeing this in pull requests for code I work with is that's a generic exception, and generic exceptions are the devil. So there's a person who is now a Django core developer who argued for this pattern. And I told him, or them, that generic exceptions are the devil. And so he went onto an online forum and asked, hey, what's wrong with this code? And the first response he got back, not from me, was generic exceptions are the devil. But he's awesome, much better than I am at this kind of stuff. But yeah, it's a nice little anecdote. So yeah, we use specific exceptions. Creating custom exceptions in Python is trivial. And you can do multiple exceptions on a single action. So please do use lots of exception. I think Jeff Knupp, who wrote the Idiomatic Guide to Python, he wrote a really good blog article about exceptions. If you can find it, read it. It's awesome. Okay, let's get a little bit controversial. Okay, using exec for dynamic imports. There's a web framework that does this. It's hard to debug. You've got security issues, and it also sets bad precedents. The thing is there are times where you really have to break the rules. I mean, Django's core internals is a good example of that. A lot of web frameworks, I guess except for Wheezy, and they're their own story, a lot of frameworks, not just web frameworks, they have to make some crazy magic happen on the inside of things. Okay, so that way they expose a nice API. And you can clean it up later, but there's always that kind of baggage that remains there. And that just happens, and that's okay. Like, we can complain about it, but it's okay. But when you're building something and you start something, if you make a design decision like this in the kernel of your application, and then other developers who look up to you and respect you, they will follow this, and this will cause them problems, and it will cause your project problems. So especially, so if you're leading a project, just think about that before you do this kind of stuff. And no, I haven't ever done this one. That's not me. So yeah, import lib. It's a core Python module. It's awesome. It's really useful and powerful. It's very explicit. You know exactly what you're getting. And because it's got the direct tie into the Python machinery, you don't have any accidental surprises like you do with the other one. Here's one. Lambdas have their place, don't get me wrong. But this is where you're trying to swap. There you go. Swap the values of a, x, and y with each other. And I could never get this to work. I think some people have managed to get this to work in Python. Again, you're breaking the whole 80-character column thing, which I guess you guys really believe in. Another problem with lambdas is lack of doc strings, and in Python we like documentation. And the other thing is this doesn't mean less character count than defining it as a function. This is this is how you do it in Python. This is how you make this work with a function. So this is less characters than the lambda. So don't go crazy on the lambdas. You also get doc strings. It's easier to read and comprehend. And functions are first-class objects in Python. They're not in Python 2.7. Are they? Are lambdas first-class objects in Python 3? Anyone? I was asking that guy since he answered before about Python 3. No, okay. So lambdas may or may not be first-class objects, so just be aware of that. Okay. Here's a good one. There was a time when it was like if you were building a framework, if you weren't configured with XML, you were not a real framework. I remember being told that about Django and turbo gears and stuff like that. But you're basically you're forcing the developers to learn a new language. Pyramid early on when it was repos.bfg, you still had to configure stuff with ZCML. And I remember eating Ethiopian food with Chris McDonough and like looking up at him with googly eyes because he's really, really smart and great to be around. And I was like saying, please change this. And I guess he did. I guess I begged enough. Here's one that's a good question, especially for us Django folks. Is Python for configuration the right way? Is this what we should be doing? The problem is, and we've all done this in settings files in Django if you've done Django, you start putting if statements and conditionals, and you start defining functions. In fact, in our book, we have that in there. Look, there's this neat way to grab environment variables. Is that a good idea? You can put in iterators. I'll get into that in a second. And you get magical configuration. If you can, I'll just show you the slide. There we go. This is Django code. I had to work with this. And yeah, this is what I told Jacob to please change in his slides. We both had to work with this project. And what this does is it's looping through a directory, finding what could be apps, and it is then installing what could be apps into a Django's installed apps. Okay? I don't know how to put it this way. It was a guy from Poland who came up with this. So you guys are smart, but it's like, be like me, be a little bit stupid. This is how you should be doing it. Type it out. It's explicit. And the other thing is it's not that much typing. And you do it once. Just get it done. It's okay. No one's going to... It's 5 or 10 minutes of typing compared to hours and hours of debugging. The other thing is, and Jacob brings this up in some of his talks, is that the code we write is meant to be read more than written. So, think about maintenance. Another thing is using a config file, which is funny that I bring this up as a fixed Python practice because I don't use this on any of my projects. I did a few years ago, but I haven't since. But config parser in Python is awesome. So I guess my fixed practice is simple Python files and config files. Documentation. Wow, I think I have a bug in my slides. Obvious things don't require doc strings. So here when I'm writing code and generating a curse-worthy bug, like I know that this Pythonista object represents a Python programmer. And this, I'm writing some code. Can anyone spot the other problem in this code sample? This is actually a no-no. We're assuming Python 2.7. Anyone?
Not extending object.
Yes, I'm not extending object. Good call. Yeah, so this is, document the critical stuff. Write down the story, especially if you have something if you have a complicated method or function or whatever. So there we go, side by side. Okay, here's another good one. So here's read Douglas Hellman's Python module of the week. Okay, have you read his this core Python by his gigantic Python book? It's huge. Well, anyway, with Python module of the week, Douglas Hellman went through all of the Python modules that there are and wrote once a week an article about it. And someone suggested for core Python that we link to those articles because it would be awesome. And people bike shedded it to death. And the killer argument that killed any desire to get Douglas Hellman's awesome stuff in there, which is written in restructured text and Sphinx and all that stuff, was, why don't we just use a wiki and have people enter stuff as they see fit? Well, but there's problems. There's a lack of version control that these things have. There's backups and mirrors. Who maintains it? We've already run into the backups and mirrors issues in the Python community with the wiki. Where we've lost a lot of content, and you just have a smaller group of contributors because you can't do it with pull requests. So yeah, use restructured text or Markdown if you have to. Sphinx, read the docs. Everyone knows readthedocs.org. Okay, if you don't, check it out. It's awesome, especially it's for open source projects, but it's awesome. So, and this is the piston. Nothing against just Bernard, but it needs to be off a wiki. And this is the old Python documentation on Read the Docs. What Read the Docs does is it hosts your Sphinx for free. And it's funded by GitTip and the Python Software Foundation. And last, here's a good one. What's that?
DSF is also good.
Oh, I didn't know that. And I know RevSef gave mine. So this is a library called that I wrote. What I suggest you do is when you go home and you get to your laptop, do sudo pip install that. And it's the anti-Zen of Python. So some good ones are nested is better than flat. Spell check is for losers. Let's see. Namespaces are too hard. Just use from module import star. So it's good to have. Sudo pip install that. It's easy. Of course, there's this, which is good, which is the Zen of Python, which Tim Peters wrote years ago. And what's really awesome about Tim Peters is, I guess it was last year, I got to meet Tim Peters, who wrote the Zen of Python, and he wrote a sorting algorithm called TimSort that has an article on Wikipedia. The man is wicked smart, so I got to meet him and gush like an abject fanboy, and it was awesome. And he said like 3 words to me, and what? And you're better because and I'm better because of it. I learned a lot. So here it is. So that's it. Any questions? Yes, sir.
Yeah, back to the attribute slide, if you could. You said, well, there's this anti-pattern of doing get name and...
Yeah, this one.
Yeah, and Django class-based use has a ton of it. It's like get query set, get object, get... Yeah, what would you recommend?
Well, the thing is so I'm trying to figure out a good way of explaining it. What the class-based views have, they let you set attributes such as template name, right? And get underscore template name is the getter. And while you could say, hey, can I just set it equal to that? There are times that, for starters, this is more intuitive. This is not, the thing is the Zen of Python is not the law. So sometimes, don't worry about it. And sometimes an explicit name like get name or get template name is better than saying, oh, just set template name to this. Is that a good explanation?
The reason it's like that in class-based views is because you could set it as an attribute, which is an actual value, or you can set it at a class level as an attribute, or it can be defined as mechanical, it needs to call a function. We need to be able to support both because it can be...
That's right, and I've actually written stuff that touches on that.
Yeah, it's more complicated than
Yeah, I know.
Just that. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, this one's hard. This one is kind of harder to explain, and it makes a lot of sense for someone coming from Java to Python. So
People look at this and, oh, you're using get query set. It's so Java-like. It's ugly.
Probably the Java world is where you take any attributes and create the getters and setters always for it.
yeah, I think that. Thank you. That was the original intent of this slide, was to show that for every being set, we do that. I mean, there are use cases where you have to do this. Russell gave us one, and but this is why we have, and there are times where you can do curious stuff that makes it so that this will not work for your needs, and the Django class-based views is a good example of that. Especially if, for example, if I create my own name, if I override a superclass's name setter or getter, do I have to remember to do all of this? Because this, doing it when I'm dealing with composition with class-based views, and I'm like 6 or 7 levels deep, and I have to remember to set my property, my getter and my setter, that's a lot of work. So that's another one. It's a usability issue from the developer. What's that? Yeah. So any other questions? Yes, sir.
Okay, well, all right. So you hit upon the SDR name, variable naming.
Yes.
Which is Hungarian notation.
Yes.
There's actually 2 types of Hungarian notation. There's systems Hungarian and there's windowing Hungarian. And this is where Microsoft owes a beer to everyone in the development community, because the one they made popular was windowing Hungarian, which is the bad one, putting your data types in front of the variable names.
Yeah.
Systems Hungarian actually says you put the data, it's not the type in the C sense, it's the class would be a better way of putting it in front there. So you wouldn't say string color, you'd say color name color. Because what you're trying to incorporate in the front is not the data type, but some qualifying characteristic.
So what Russ is talking about is the difference between windowing notation, which is which I'm demonstrating, what I've run into, and you're talking about the Hungarian version. Systems Hungarian. So Windows Hungarian, which is what we're seeing here, which is courtesy of our friends at Microsoft. Hey, they gave us Halo, and which is originally supposed to be on the Mac, but and then there's systems, which
Well, so the systems Hungarian is interesting because what you're prefixing is, you wouldn't say string, but you might say secure, for example, because what you're describing is this is a string, but it's a string that contains a value that has been vetted as secure, and whenever you see a variable name that is prefixed with secure, you know that it's gone through whatever process it needed to go through to be secure.
Not how you do things in Python usually.
Yeah, well, and that's the question I was going to pose, is how far does duck typing go when qualities and properties like that need to happen?
I don't know the answer. Does anyone know the answer to that?
I guess I have some more comments on it. For a lot of these things, it's just duplicate information, like Boolean active in the name that just implies Booleanness. But there are situations where I find that actually having some kind of hint as to what the data type will be is valuable. With writing web applications in Django, especially times and dates that also pass data to the database, suffixing things with str or ek or ts makes it gives you a hint that it's part of.
Actually, I'll give you another good use case against that argues for like suffixes, and that's the fact that I am a native English speaker. You guys are, the majority of you are native Polish speakers. If you're not familiar with American colloquialisms and you work for a U.S. company, we are using American colloquialisms for our field name declarations, that's going to confuse it. The same thing goes as if I learn Polish well enough that I could join you guys on a Polish language project. I might need to have that assistance of seeing at the end of the variable name, seeing that _date. So, and I've that myself, even with, you know, I'll have publish date or instead of published, because does publish mean is it true or false? Publish date. So there. Wow, you guys are like killing my slides. Stop it. So, questions? Okay. All right. Thank you very much.